When you think of someone who is involved with knitting, what comes to mind? A grandmother knitting a pair of socks for her grandson? A mother working on a scarf for her daughter? What about a grown man? The reality is that knitting attracts a wide variety of people, including men. Some do it for hobby, others professionally. Bill Toms is a high school instructor who voluntarily teaches knitting to his students as part of his visual arts classes.
I actually started knitting by mistake, or by default, I suppose. My mother was taking a knitting class. She gave me money for Christmas to actually buy the yarn and the pattern to make me a sweater. And I did the purchase, I brought it home, I love the pattern, love the colors, and she looked at it and said, "This is way too hard, I can't make it." And I thought, well, I've got the yarn, got the pattern, love it, so I decided I would actually make it myself. I did all kinds of stuff, so everything, I've done stuffed animals, mittens, full sweaters, hats, scarves. My latest sort of obsession is socks. Initially when I started knitting, and people would say, "Oh, I really love what you're wearing, where'd you get it?" I would always lie and say my mother made it. Okay. And I did that for several years, and after a while it was like, why am I giving her all the credit? And I started being truthful and saying, I made this myself.
Bill describes why he decided to teach his high school students to knit.
I think that by the time they're in grade 12, there's a lot of things that they still haven't tried, and I think it's good to introduce that sort of concept to them. I was really quite surprised. I thought that, well, first of all, the ratio of female to male in the art class is actually quite high. So probably out of 46 kids, I might have taught maybe 8 boys to knit. And there haven't been, at least to my knowledge, any sort of protests. I think, well, one stereotype is going to be, first of all, it's a grandmother, that it's a woman as well. I think it's breaking down more. If you begin to again look online, there are actually several websites that are dedicated to men who knit. I say probably the first time I told someone who was a stranger that I made it myself, it was actually a teller at a bank, and her disposition toward me changed. Like initially she was very sort of friendly and open, and I said, "Oh, I made it myself." She suddenly was very sort of cold and frosty, so I think that at that point about like 25 years ago, that things were a bit more narrow. I think things are much more open now, although it's harder to judge because I spent most of my life in a university setting or in an arts high school setting where kids tend to be, for the most part, much more open than in the real world. Like, so I'm sure if I went to like a Blue Jays baseball game and pulled up my knitting, I'd probably get beat up.
Some people find it bizarre that men take part in knitting, but for guys like Jonathan Leonard, it's just part of life. Jonathan is the manager at Romney Wools, a yarn store in downtown Toronto. He tells us about his experience as a man who not only knits, but is involved in the industry as well.
I started knitting fairly recently, probably the last 6 years or so. When I teach the spinning class, I talk about Middle Ages, darker ages, where you used to do everything by hand and everything was spun by hand because you had to actually pretty much stand in urine. Not something women really enjoyed doing, but used to get buckets and drape the fabric over, and the natural ammonia from the urine back then, you couldn't go to the store and buy ammonia. You had to use the chamber pots, and they would step in the pots basically. Sometimes there's a phobia about it, it'll be less masculine doing knitting or whatnot, but generally, I don't know if it's something that they do to get girls occasionally, but to show their talent, some of the guys will try and dive into projects. And I've actually had some beginner knitters, men, do some pretty interesting, talented first projects, which I probably wouldn't have taken on as my first project. Maybe to impress somebody or whatnot, but as a rule of thumb, no, they're pretty open-minded about it, and it's just something to work with your hands,
Margie Davidson has been knitting for almost 8 decades. She tells us about the role that men played in knitting when she was growing up.
It was never considered a feminine, only a lady's job to knit. The men were in on it too, and they weren't ashamed of it. They just sort of got away from it over the years, and now they're getting back to it because they use it for therapy. You have to handle the sheep, and they're not. They weigh a lot. That was never a lady's job.
Although men often do face scrutiny for their decision to knit, it hasn't always been that way. As Margie described, men have just gotten away from it over the years.
Like my friend here, she took a lot of work 50 years ago, but she's still good.